Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into the dramatic rise and fall of a truly monumental and, honestly, highly contradictory historical figure, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. Get ready because this is a story packed with impossible academic ascents, massive global conflicts, and deeply, deeply tragic flaws.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because we are exploring a life full of staggering achievements that quite literally reshaped the globe, right alongside deep moral blind spots that leave a very complicated legacy. It's a true historical paradox. Figuring out exactly how a single leader can encompass such extreme highs and lows is going to be a fascinating journey.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll trace his life through 5 distinct chapters. From Princeton to politics, the New Freedom Agenda, a regressive racial record, reluctant entry into war, and finally, the fight for peace. Let's get right to it. Chapter 1, From Princeton to Politics, the Unlikely Ascent. You know, Wilson's early life isn't exactly what you'd expect for a global statesman. He actually struggled with severe dyslexia as a boy, growing up in the post-Civil War South. And this brilliantly illustrates just how wild his later trajectory really was. In 1910, he was an academic navigating university disputes as the president of Princeton. Just 1 year later, he was the governor of New Jersey. And by 1913, he's the president of the United States. It's literally one of the most astonishingly fast leaps from administration to the Oval Office in American history. So how did he pull off this incredible leap? Well, the election of 1912 handed him the perfect storm. The incumbent Republican president, William Howard Taft, ended up being challenged by his own predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt, who ran third party under the progressive or bull moose banner. This bitter split in the Republican base absolutely paved the way for Wilson. He campaigned hard on his progressive ideals and ended up winning a massive landslide victory, capturing 435 electoral college votes to Roosevelt's 88. Chapter 2, The New Freedom Agenda, a Wave of Reforms. Let's move to and see how this builds, because once in the Oval Office, this former professor didn't just theorize about government. He completely overhauled it with an ambitious agenda he called the New Freedom. Basically, he hit the ground running with 3 huge steps. First, lowering tariffs and introducing a federal income tax to make up the revenue. Second, completely overhauling the banking system. And third, passing the Clayton Antitrust Act, which banned anti-competitive practices to finally rein in those massive corporate monopolies. But the crown jewel of this domestic agenda is something you still interact with every single day, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. After a severe financial panic in 1907, the nation was desperate for central oversight. Wilson fiercely insisted on a government-run system rather than a private one. He set up a network of 12 regional banks overseen by a presidentially appointed board. And get this, he made a strict rule that absolutely no private bankers could sit on it. It remains one of his most enduring legacies today.
Moving on to Chapter 3, a regressive racial record, the Great Contradiction.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we have to impartially examine a stark, unignorable paradox in his administration. On one hand, you have Wilson, the progressive economic reformer and anti-imperialist, but on the exact same token, his administration actively rolled back the civil rights of African Americans. The historical record here presents a profound contradiction, and honestly, we just have to let the historical facts speak for themselves. To break that down factually, Wilson brought committed segregationists into his cabinet. He implemented measures that made it incredibly difficult for African Americans to acquire or advance in federal jobs, literally introducing segregation into Washington, D.C. government offices. In 1915, The Birth of a Nation, a film widely credited with causing a massive surge in Ku Klux Klan membership, became the very first film ever screened at the White House. Furthermore, during the horrific Red Summer race riots of 1919, Wilson took zero executive action to stop the violence against Black Americans. These policies represent an unquestionable black mark on his presidency, and they ultimately cost him the support of the African American community that had previously backed him. Chapter 4, Reluctant Entry into War, From Neutrality to Conflict. So let's zoom out to the global stakes of 1914. The outbreak of World War I coincided tragically with the death of Wilson's first wife, Ellen, from kidney disease. Reeling from this massive personal loss, Wilson looked across the Atlantic and declared strict neutrality. He famously called it a war with which we have nothing to do. And actually, that recurring motif of reluctance paid off politically. He won a super narrow re-election in 1916, largely on the promise of keeping America out of the conflict. But of course, reality was about to come crashing in.
A rapid, undeniable sequence of German provocations eventually forced his hand. It all started with submarine attacks on merchant ships in 1915, peaking with the tragic sinking of the British liner Lusitania, killing 128 Americans. Now, Wilson managed to secure a temporary pause on that, but by early 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Just weeks later, the infamous Zimmermann telegram was intercepted, revealing Germany's secret attempt to ally with Mexico against the U.S. Left with absolutely zero options, Wilson pivoted. In April 1917, he declared to Congress that the world must be made safe for democracy.
Once he committed, the scale of American mobilization was just staggering. Under Wilson's administration, nearly 3 million men were conscripted into the U.S. Army. We're talking raising over $15 billion in Liberty loans to finance the effort. To put that into perspective, by the summer of 1918, 10,000 American troops were arriving in France every single day. This massive influx of manpower and resources was the tipping point, finally forcing Germany to agree to an armistice in November 1918.
And that brings us to Chapter 5, The Fight for Peace, a Tragic Downfall.
So the crucial point is, when the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Wilson's greatest battle was actually just beginning. He became the first sitting U.S. president to travel to Europe, and he brought with him this grand, idealistic vision, his famous 14 points. He didn't want a victor's peace. He pushed for a peace without victory, to end all future wars. He argued for things like freedom of the seas, reducing global armaments, autonomy for national minorities, an independent Poland, and, most importantly, creating a general association of nations, which we know as the League of Nations, to mediate global disputes.
But when Wilson sat down at the negotiating table in Paris, his idealism violently collided with European trauma. Wilson desperately wanted to show mercy, to build a lasting framework for peace. Meanwhile, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George were demanding a triumphalist settlement. They wanted massive reparations and harsh territorial losses for Germany. In the end, Wilson had to compromise on a ton of his own points just to save his precious League of Nations. And tragically, by doing so, he inadvertently helped sign a Treaty of Versailles that sowed the very seeds for World War II.
Then comes his tragic final act. Wilson brought the treaty back home to the U.S., only to face fierce, unrelenting opposition in the Senate, who were terrified that joining the League would drag America into endless foreign conflicts. Refusing to compromise even an inch, Wilson embarked on this grueling, cross-country speaking tour to appeal directly to the American public. The immense stress was just too much. It caused a debilitating stroke that paralyzed the left side of his body. For the rest of his presidency, he was an invalid, quietly shielded from the public by his wife, Edith. And the most heartbreaking irony of the whole shebang, the United States Senate ultimately rejected the treaty. America never even joined the very League of Nations that Wilson sacrificed his health to create. We've seen his lightning-fast rise to power, his massive economic overhauls, his unquestionable moral failings regarding race, and his deeply flawed, tragic crusade for global peace. So I have to leave you with this question. How do we weigh these monumental global and domestic achievements against his deep flaws? Was he one of the most successful progressive presidents in history, or a cautionary tale of uncompromising idealism? It's a wonderfully complex history that absolutely demands further exploration. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.